G'day Gear Junkies, Jason here. The 80s is remembered for a lot of things, but in the pedal market, the 80s is the era in which the Japanese companies really took over, particularly Boss. During this period, they put out of business some iconic brands such as Electro Harmonix and MXR. I've already covered the first few years of the Boss Compact series, starting from 1977 through to 1982. So for this video, we are looking at the Japanese era, part 2. Now, before I begin, as always, if you like this kind of content, please subscribe if you haven't already. And I'd just like to mention that this video and its predecessor are two of the most expensive, or the two most expensive videos I've ever had to make. It took me about 1.5 years to collect all these pedals and cost me an exorbitant amount of money. And since the first video came out, a lot of people want me to do the subsequent eras that came after the Japanese era. Now, I'm happy to do that, but I do not have the resources. I'm not Josh Scott. I don't have the world's largest pedal collection. So it's hard for me to do that without some assistance. So I have set up a Patreon account. If you want to support me making these videos and my other Boss Through the Years videos, you can go to Patreon and you can become a member for $5 a month, or you can wing me some money, and that will go directly into buying all of the gear I need to continue to make these videos. So if you do that, it is very greatly appreciated. So if you're not following on from the first video, I've determined through my own amateur research that there have been 5 distinctive design phases in Boss's history. There was the Japanese era part 1, Japanese era part 2, there was the tweakability or functionality era in the 90s, then there was the digital era, and there is currently the retrospective era. Originally, I believed that the Japanese era was one long era in Boss's history. But it wasn't until I started to collect these pedals, I noticed that there is a very obvious line in the sand from 1983 onwards. I noticed that the pedals that came out from 1983 onwards were a lot more uniform in their design than the pedals that had come out in the years prior. Going back to 1980, Boss bring out the BF2 flanger, and it's the first compact pedal to have 4 knobs. This has 4 different controls on it. 2 years later, they bring out the VB2, which has 3 controls and a mode selector. What I noticed from 1983 onwards is that most of their pedals that they would bring out would either have 4 controls or 3 controls and a mode selector. The other thing I noticed in this era, and this is more of a cosmetic thing, was that they would start to use the number 2 as being the first number for each new model that would come out. So the VB2 is a good example here. There is no VB1. But it starts on 2, so VB2. So they start to do away with the number 1, and we hardly ever see it again until many, many years later. So in 1983, the first pedal to come out in this new era was the HM2 Heavy Metal. This came out in October of 1983. Now it features 4 controls, and it was the first Boss pedal to be marketed specifically at metal players. Now, this particular unit was very, very popular in the Swedish death metal or black metal scene. People would crank up their Marshall valve state, solid state amplifiers, and then put one of these in front of it and just dime all of the controls. I was very surprised to learn out of all the people that were known for using this, Dave Gilmour apparently used this pedal. So I couldn't tell you what song he used it on, but apparently Dave Gilmour was a fan. In late 1983, Boss started to manufacture a pedal that would revolutionize the pedal industry. It's one of the most important pedals ever created. It's the Boss DD2 Digital Delay. This is the first digital guitar pedal of any kind, by any brand. So you think about all the digital pedals that you have today, they wouldn't exist without this guy. This is the first digital pedal. Prior to this, if you wanted a digital delay, you had to get a rack unit, but this made it possible for players to get digital quality delays with a small footprint. One of the cool things about this pedal is that it was the second Boss pedal to have an integrated foot switch, the first being the VB2. So if you put it into hold mode, the pedal doesn't come on unless you hold down the foot switch. So you could do your shred and solo that's got heaps of notes, and then if you want to hold a note, just hold this down and you'll get your repeats, and then you take your foot off and the repeats go away. So that was a really cool feature that this pedal pioneered amongst delay pedals. Also, the DD2 here has a very large and long DSP chip inside, goes right the way across the circuit board. We know this as the long chip. Now, pretty much all of the digital delay units that Boss bring out in the 80s would feature this long chip. Now, the subsequent ones that would come out in the 90s and the improvements made to these circuits, they were able to shrink those down, but a lot of people value this long chip very, very highly and believe that it actually has a sound and a character all of its own. So any of these pedals that have the long chip are worth more on the second-hand market. In 1984, Boss bring out the DF2 Super Feedbacker and Distortion. It was originally known as the Super Distortion and Feedbacker. I've done a whole video on the quirks of earlier Boss pedals, so if you want to nerd out on that, watch this other video. The DF2 here is basically a DS1 style circuit. It's got an improved tone control, but it has a party trick, and that party trick is the overtone. So this control on the end controls either a low or a high overtone, which when you hold down the foot switch, again, another integrated foot switch, you get this endless sustained feedback, either an octave down or an octave up. I've covered this in a bit more detail in another video, which is about Boss's orange distortion pedals. So if you want more details on this, check out that other video. Next up was one of my personal favorites, the PH2 Super Phaser. Now, by this stage, Boss has been around for about 7 years, and this is the third phaser that they'd brought out in the first 7 years of their history. This one would stay in production until about 2001, but it doesn't sound anything like the phases that had come out previously, or pretty much any of these 70s style phases. It has its own sound, and that's partly because they use a feedback control, a bit like a flanger, where they feedback part of the signal into itself, and it gives it a really sort of spacey characteristic that's really cool. It's got two modes, which is, I think you've got a 10-stage phaser and a 12-stage phaser. The 12-stage one has less of the dry signal, so it's a bit more robotic, I suppose you could say. But it's a really cool pedal, and it was used by one of my guitar heroes, Mike Einzinger of Incubus, a lot in their early days. The last pedal that Boss would bring out in 1984 was the DM3, and this was the successor to the much-loved DM2, which had come out in 1981. Now, funnily enough, these two are very similar. The DM3 is supposed to be a slight upgrade on the DM2, but the delay time's the same. It's 300 milliseconds, which isn't a whole lot. Now, if you watch the channel Ask Zach, he rates the DM3 very highly. He actually prefers it over the DM2. Now, from what I've researched, the DM3 here was brought out primarily because the parts to make the DM2 had become a lot cheaper, which meant that they could sell them for cheaper. But rather than disenfranchise all the stores that had DM2s sitting on shelves by bringing out a new version of the DM2 that was cheaper, they brought out a new model called the DM3, and they discontinued the DM2. Now, they would do this again a few times during the decade. Another interesting thing about the DM3 here is that it features these really strange knobs. No other Boss pedal has the same knobs as the DM3. These were supposed to look like rack unit knobs, apparently. In 1985, we see the successor of the classic old OD1, which was the OD2 Turbo Overdrive. Now, the turbo overdrive has a turbo on-off switch here on the side. So when it's on, it gives you a higher gain overdrive, which is very compressed, very good for lead work and things like that. With it off, it's just sort of a tube screamer style overdrive. In the 90s, the OD2 circuit here received a bit of a lifeline when they released the OD2R, which was a revised version of the OD2. Crucially, it has a remote jack, so you can plug in an external foot switch to be able to toggle between the two modes. Next, we have an interesting one that I think is very underrated, which is the HF2 high band flanger. Now, this is very closely related to the BF2 flanger. The main difference is that it modulates a lot faster than the BF2, so that the modulation basically is about an octave higher than the original BF2 here. So for me, I find that the HF2 sounds better on clean guitar than the BF2 does. It's described in the Boss book as being a more elegant effect. The HF2 stayed in production until the mid-90s. Now, interestingly, when they brought out the BF3 in the early 2000s, it featured a mode called Ultra Mode. Ultra Mode is a digital version of the HF2. Another interesting pedal of 1985 is the DSD2 digital sampler and delay. This is almost exactly the same circuit as the DD2. It has the same long chip inside. It has all the same delay modes except for the hold mode that this has. It doesn't have that. What it does have though is a sample and play mode. So think of it as a very, very early looper. Unfortunately though, it only was able to record 0.8 of a second. Not 8 seconds, 0.8 of a second. So very, very short loops. Basically you put it into record mode, you record your one note that you can play, and then you put it into play mode, and then whenever you hold down the foot switch, it would just endlessly play that loop. Although the sample and play function on this is pretty much useless, it is a great delay pedal. And if you're looking for a long chip delay on the secondhand market, the DD2 here is fairly pricey, whereas the DSD2 here goes for a fair bit cheaper. So to cap off 1985, which was a memorable year for Boss pedals, they brought out one of their Hall of Fame pedals, which was the DC2 Dimension C. I've done a whole video on the Dimension series of pedals. This one is one of my favorite Boss pedals ever made. It's very, very unique, purely from the layout perspective. So this is based on the Roland Dimension D rack unit. So remember, Roland are Boss's parent company. This is kind of a stomp box version of that. We have 4 presets. You can only use one at a time. So these buttons are presets. Particularly 3 and 4, those settings are absolutely beautiful. You get a very lush stereo effect by using this pedal. It uses 2 different delay clocks simultaneously out of phase, so it just creates this dimensional effect. It's different from a chorus. It's very hi-fi. It's very studio sounding, and it's really great for intricate parts, I think. Like the VB2 Vibrato, this pedal didn't sell very well, but there was a lot of hype about it, particularly in the early internet days on fan forums and gear pages, and these became very, very valuable on the secondhand market. And Boss were able to respond to that by bringing out the Wazacraft version of this pedal, which is also fantastic. In 1986, Boss followed their natural progression of development and released the CS3. So the CS1 had 2 knobs, the CS2 had 3 knobs, and this has 4. So remember 4 being the uniform standard of Boss pedals during this period in time. The CS3 is still made today. It's one of their longest running pedals. It has gone through some design changes. I have dealt with this in another video if you're interested in that. So just like the DM2 and the DM3 that I already talked about, some of the parts to make the DD2 became cheaper over time. This was a hugely expensive pedal back in the day when it came out. So rather than disenfranchise all the stores that had these on shelves, what they decided to do was basically just rebadge it and call it the DD3, now that the parts were a bit cheaper to buy. So they were able to make this cheaper than the DD2. The DD3 has been used by legends of the guitar world. There's too many to name. Look it up if you want to check that out. But it is an absolute legend of a pedal. It has had some design changes. This is an early Japanese one with the long chip. They no longer make it like that anymore, but it's still essentially the same pedal. There were a lot of very short-lived Boss pedals in the 80s, and the FT2 is definitely one of those. This was brought in to replace the old TW1 Touch Wah, which was released in 1978. It went out of production in 1987. This came into production in 1986 and was out of production by 1988, so only 2 years later. So basically this is a 2-mode envelope filter, but also has manual modes so that you can plug in an expression pedal and use it like a normal wah pedal. However, as I explained in a recent video about these pedals, I just don't think it's a particularly good sounding wah. Owing to the fact that there's not many of them out there, they're hugely expensive on the secondhand market. The previous year in 1985, we saw the DSD2, and this was replaced the following year by the DSD3. And once again, it's the same pedal. So just like the DD2 and the DD3, the parts to make the DSD2 had become cheaper. Rather than disenfranchise stores that still had these on the shelves, they came up with a new model, which is the DSD3. As you can see, the condition of these two pedals is quite different. This is a mint condition one. I've got the box and everything. When I bought the DSD3, I didn't really care what condition it was in because I already have one. They're the exact same pedal. (1986) was also the year that Boss released their first bass pedal, which was the BF2B bass flanger. Now this video is already going to be long enough as it is, so I chose not to include the bass pedals for this video, but what I will do is hopefully sometime in the future I will do a video about all of their bass pedals. Boss have never brought out as many pedals in a single year as they did in 1987. They released 6 guitar pedals and 3 bass pedals. One of these pedals was the DS2 Turbo Distortion. This goes along the same lines as the Turbo Overdrive, which came out 2 years earlier. But crucially, the DS2 Turbo Distortion has a remote jack, so you can plug in a remote switch to toggle between the 2 different modes. turbo mode on the DS2 here is different to the OD2. With the OD2, it gives you a massive gain boost, whereas on the DS2, it gives you a massive mid boost. Now the DS2 really takes the old DS1 and brings it into the new uniform that they were going for in this particular period of time. Now, this pedal has been used by many famous guitarists. John Frusciante has 2 of these on his pedal board currently. Kurt Cobain was a known user of this pedal also, as well as many others. And this pedal is so popular that it still remains in production today. The Boss PS2 digital pitch shifter and delay is their first foray into digital pitch shifting. It could even be the first pitch shifter pedal ever released. This came out 2 years before the Digitech Whammy. Now, this is probably my least favorite pedal that came out in the Japanese era, because as a pitch shifter, it's pretty terrible. However, this pedal does have a saving grace, which is the fact that it is a killer delay pedal. This remained in production until the mid-90s when it was replaced by the PS3. In my opinion, the most significant pedal that Boss would bring out in 1987 was the RV2 Digital Reverb. This is the very first digital reverb pedal by any brand. It features 4 different types of reverb plus a delay mode as well. Couple of interesting facts about the RV2. Firstly, it wasn't made for very long. I can't find out why it wasn't made for very long. And also, it came in a larger box because it also included a power supply. And they decided to include a power supply with this pedal because it drew so much more current than all of their other pedals. The only other compact pedal that came with a power supply was the PSM5. Now, one of the most complex and misunderstood pedals that Boss brought out around this time was the MZ2 Digital Metalizer. This is one of the first, if not the first, analog digital hybrid pedal ever made. So it's an analog distortion circuit, and it is a very good distortion circuit. It's one of my favorite ones that Boss have ever done, but it has some digital effects on board. And these mainly revolve around sort of doubling effects. So if you know the TC Mimic, which is a pedal that TC have had out for a while, it mimics the sound of a guitar that's been double tracked in the studio to make it sound bigger. Well, Boss had this idea way back in the 80s, and it also gives you 2 outputs as well. It has a couple of chorus modes, because playing distorted guitar with chorus back then was considered a cool thing to do. But it was really a pedal that was light years ahead of its time. Noise gate pedals had been around since the 70s. In fact, Boss brought out a noise gate in 1979, which was the NF1 noise gate. They replaced it in 1987 with the NS2 noise suppressor. Now this had a few upgrades. So it has 2 different modes. It's got reduction and mute. So if you wanted to use it like this as a noise gate, which cuts down the noise below a certain threshold, you would set it to reduction mode. Or you could put it into mute mode, which means that you get a really hard and sharp mute. This is much loved by rhythm players in the metal scene. The NS2 is the first of 3 pedals to have an LED here instead of a knob, and this indicates how hard the pedal is actually working. You're able to do a 9-volt out to daisy chain power to other pedals, just like the PSM5. But the coolest feature about this pedal is when you're using a noise gate and you're using delay, it cuts off those delay trails. It can be quite harsh sometimes. So if you wanted to have a noise gate effect but still retain your delays, what you can do is plug any of those type effects through this loop here, and they will be unaffected by the noise gate. So what you do is you plug in your noisy pedals before this one, you put this one after, and then you run an effects loop for your delays and reverbs. Another misunderstood pedal of 1987 was the LM2 limiter. This was not a particularly big seller. I don't think having a pedal called a limiter was ever going to be a big seller amongst guitarists who just want to get louder. However, it is a very useful tool. So it acts a bit like a compressor. So whereas a compressor will stop your volume from getting over a certain amount and will also boost up the softest part of your signal as well, thereby compressing your volume, this doesn't do the part where the upwards compression. It doesn't boost those quieter parts. It just stops you from hitting certain volumes depending on how you got it set. So this makes it really useful for things like clean guitar, acoustic guitar, and bass guitar. (1988) was the last year that a new pedal would come out of Japan. They would continue to manufacture some pedals in Japan. Typically, they're more complex digital circuits, but they moved a lot of their simpler analog circuits off to Taiwan for manufacturing starting in 1988. The last new pedal to come out of Japan was the DC3 Digital Dimension, which replaced the DC2 Dimension C. Another significant thing about this pedal is that it is Boss's first digital modulation pedal. Now, back in the 80s and 90s, digital was not the dirty word that it is today. It was basically a selling point. So any digital pedals that Boss brought out, they proudly advertised that it was digital. Now, this particular pedal sounds like a chorus and it sounds a bit, like a dimension effect. However, it does have a bit of a slapback thing going on as well. So it is slightly different. It's not quite the same as the original DC2. From 1989 onwards, all new pedals would come out of Taiwan, but I regard the next 2 years, 89 and 90, as part of the Japanese era part 2 for a couple of reasons. Number one, the design philosophy was still the same. It hadn't changed from the previous years. But also, manufacturing was still happening in Japan at this time, but it was just the more complex circuits like the MZ2 and the DC3 that were still being made in Japan at this time. So in 1989, Boss released their first new pedal to come out of Taiwan, which is the CH1 Super Chorus. Now, if you follow the CE line of pedals, the CE1 has a single control, the CE2 has 2, the CE3 has 3. So the natural progression was to make it uniform and have 4 controls. Now, the reason this isn't the CE4, I've heard, is because of cultural reasons, and the Japanese do not believe the number 4 to be a lucky number. So instead of that, they call it the CH1, and this is the first time in years that they'd actually used the number 1 for a new pedal. my opinion, the CH1 here is a pretty underrated chorus pedal, and you can find them pretty cheap on the secondhand market as they've been out for a very long time. They're still being manufactured today. However, the current day models are very different to one of these original models. So for the first 12 years of its life, from 89 through to 2001, they were analog using Bucket Brigade devices. However, currently they are now digital. So they were converted to digital in late 2001 along with the CE5, and they sound a little bit different. The current day ones are really cheap on the second-hand market. However, these analog ones do go for a bit more. So 1990 was the last year of the Japanese era Part 2. And it was in that year that they brought out one of their rarest and most sought after pedals, the Tremolo Panna PN2. This is an interesting pedal. It's their first fully stereo pedal, meaning that it could actually accept a stereo signal going into it and then take that stereo signal going out of it as well. So all of their stereo pedals up to this point had mono in and stereo out. This has stereo in and stereo out. I find it interesting that tremolo is the oldest guitar effect that exists, and yet it took Boss until 1990 to create their first tremolo pedal. But what a pedal this is. Now, if you're familiar with the TR2, which came out a few years later, this has rate and depth, which this also has, and it has a rotary knob in the middle that lets you choose between your waveform. So either a square wave or a triangle wave. This one just gives you a mode selector, so you can choose square wave, triangle wave, and then you have both of those modes again for the panning mode. Now, panning mode was when you have it in stereo and it basically sort of goes like a windscreen wiper from one speaker to the other. Like the NS2, this has an extra LED here which shows you how fast the rate of the pedal is traveling at. So this was only made for a very short period of time, and as a result it is worth a lot on the second-hand market. When I was doing my videos about the OD series and the DS series, I couldn't find a place for the OS2 overdrive distortion. This is a kind of blending of the two. It actually has two circuits in here. So they both run off the same level, drive, and tone controls. However, the fourth control is kind of where the magic happens on this pedal. So it's called color. So with it all the way down, it's on the overdrive circuit. When you turn it all the way up, it's on the distortion circuit. And everywhere in between is a blend between the two circuits, overdrive and distortion. So if you want your overdrive with a bit more hair on it, you just turn that up a bit. If you want your distortion with a little less compression and a little bit more to be a little bit more responsive, you just wind it down a little bit from the distortion side. This is a very unique pedal in Boss's catalogue, and I was very surprised to find out that it is still being made, or at least up until a couple of years ago it was still being made. I haven't actually seen one in a store for probably 20 years, so I thought this was long extinct, but apparently it's not. And the last pedal of the Boss Japanese Era Part 2 is another oddball pedal, which is the EH2 Enhancer. This is one of those sort of magic dust pedals that people don't know what it does. Basically, it's Boss's version of the BBE Sonic Maximizer. So it's supposed to just add a bit more sort of top-end clarity to your signal. So you have a mix knob, a frequency knob, and a sensitivity knob with a sensitivity LED to sort of indicate how hard this thing is working. So basically, think of it kind of like, not like a buffer, but it just adds a bit of top-end sparkle to your sound. Unsurprisingly, the EH2 here was not a big seller, but surprisingly, it stayed in their catalogue for a long time. It actually went out of production in 1999, which means that this had a much longer life than a lot of Boss's legendary pedals like the DC2 and the VB2. But yeah, go figure. In 1991, we see a shift in Boss pedal designs, which is really focused on making their pedals more tweakable and more flexible, and really coincides with the invention of the concentric pots, which they used here on the Metal Zone, but also in several other pedals. The ones that have mode selectors now have way more modes. Instead of having 1 or 2 or 3, we're starting to look at some pedals that have 10 or 11 or even 12 different modes. So that was my look at the Boss Japanese era part 2. Please leave a comment below and tell me which were your favorite pedals from this era. Maybe let me know which ones you didn't like as well. That'd be interesting. And which ones would you bring back if you could? So if you enjoyed this video, please give it a like. And if you haven't already, please subscribe. You can support this channel by going to the Middle Age Gear Junkie store and buying some merchandise, and also joining the Middle Age Gear Junkie Facebook page. I'd love to have you. I've got the links down below for those and also for my Patreon page. Other than that, my name is Jason. Have a wonderful day. See you in the next one.